Are you there?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes. Should we introduce ourselves?
We should. I'm Michelle Goldberg. I'm a journalist whose work appears in many places, including The Daily Beast, The American Prospect, and I am an author, most recently, of The Means of Reproduction, Sex, Power, and the Future of the World.
Which is a fantastic book that I love and recommend to everybody. And is now in paperback.
It is. It just came out in paperback. Thank you for reminding me.
I am Rebecca Traister. I'm a senior writer at Salon.com. I'm a journalist who writes for other places, and I just finished writing my first book that will be published in September called Big Girls Don't Cry, The Election That Changed Everything for American Women. It's about the 2008 election. Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin and Michelle Obama and Elizabeth Edwards and American women and feminism and Tina Fey and, all about women, culture, and electoral politics.
Which will, I'm sure, be as timely in September as it was in November.
Given that
these issues seem to be so perennial.
Well, it's amazing because, it turns out that it was a lot of fun to write about that 2008 election, in part because so many of the things that we were talking about then with regard to gender, with regard to lots of different stuff, but certainly with regard to gender and the place of reproductive rights within a democratic platform, the place of women with, on the right, a sort of right-wing version of feminism, are actually things that are still being talked about and written about and that we may even talk about today. A lot of the issues that were brought up during the election are things that play out before us every day since.
Actually, we were going to start talking about a different article, but maybe, since you brought it up, maybe we could start out by talking about an article that made me want to bash my head into a wall. This piece that Hannah Rosen wrote for Slate about is the Tea Party movement an incubator of feminism or something like that. It was the title was probably a little different. It's not that she wrote the article that made me want to bash my head against the wall, but I guess the idea that a movement is feminist just because a lot of women are involved, by that standard, the Christian right would have been one of the most feminist movements ever. And in fact, what she wrote about reminded me a lot of reading about the organizing of the Christian right, where it was, a lot of kind of women organizing at the grassroots level, women like Sarah Palin, who felt like they were defending their family from some encroaching threat. And there was often an elliptical feminism even then, even when they were organizing on explicitly anti-feminist terms, like explicitly against the Equal Rights Amendment, when all of a sudden they were, out there involved in politics and becoming spokespeople. And, Phyllis Schlafly is a perfect example of this. I guess the difference now is that they're calling themselves feminists, but other than that, I'm not sure how much has changed.
Well, I'm not sure that it's a question of change. I do think it's worth saying that there are elements, and this was something that I was reminded of by reading Gail Collins' book a couple months ago, When Everything Changed. And one of the things she wrote about was that historically, in fact, there was some conservative female support for things that we now consider feminist. Mm-hmm. That feminism for a while actually was part of a more conservative agenda than the liberal agenda, which is really interesting. I did a lot of thinking about this, the rights or the Republican Party's embrace of feminism, the word, that I began to see during the election, specifically around Sarah Palin. And I think that the thing that Hannah Rosen was writing about was these number of women who feel that they've been empowered, perhaps by Sarah Palin, perhaps, by their own conservative investment in Tea Party politics, which is a whole other thing. And they're perceiving themselves as feminists and using that word with abandon. And of course, it makes me want to bang my head against the wall too. But I think that some of the dynamics that undergird it are complicated because, yes, it is Phyllis Schlafly all over again. But there are certain things, like when you take apart Sarah Palin, for instance, there are certain things about Sarah Palin's career and her ability to have a career while having 5 children, for instance, and having a husband who shares the domestic responsibility that allowed her to become the youngest and first female governor of Alaska, that then, landed her through a series of unfortunate events on the Republican presidential ticket. There are really interesting. Sarah Palin is an inheritor of feminist progress, something that she said during the campaign. She benefited from Title IX. She benefited from the larger message that women can do everything, that in fact domestic partnership should be shared. She put that into practice in ways that actually are progressive. We need to be seeing more women who have families that run that way.
Well, no, and it certainly represented a kind of, at least, if not an embrace, maybe a capitulation against the old conservative upholding of a kind of very traditional two-parent family. I mean, I was reminded of this when I was writing about George Rackers, one of the co-founders of the Family Research Council, and his adventures with young baggage handlers in Rome. When I was writing about him, yeah. I read this paper that he had written for a group called the Coalition on Revival, which was a religious right group in the 80s, kind of an interesting group that brought together the people we know from the religious right with really hardcore theocrats, kind of people that, even the religious right tries to keep in the closet a little bit. So he wrote this paper for them. It was one of several kind of worldview statements that they put out. And it was all about how women shouldn't work, how if there's like a financial catastrophe in the family, then a woman with her husband's permission might take temporary employment, but they should regard this as a disaster and pray to God for deliverance from this kind of unnatural situation. I mean, that rhetoric is clearly gone. They've clearly accepted, right. And it's kind of what they do with, it's kind of what conservatives did with race. For a long time they, or at least the mainstream of the right-wing movement, demonized Martin Luther King, demonized all kind of efforts at desegregation, treated Brown versus the Board of Education as this terrible usurpation of local authority. And then when they realized that they had kind of lost and that it had moved into the mainstream, they pretended that they had been on the side of Martin Luther King all along, and that actually Martin Luther King was the primary exemplar of their values, and that these other liberals were, trashing his noble legacy. So it's kind of what they, so now they're doing something similar with feminism. No, we're the real feminists, and Sarah Palin is Exhibit A. I think
right. Well, here's the thing, though. It's very interesting what you say about race, because this is actually an argument I've just made in my book, and about what the right did to feminism, the word and the concept, over the past few decades, was really work to demonize it, and that Phyllis Schlafly first and foremost, the Independent Women's Forum, conservatives worked very hard to demonize and caricaturize feminists as sort of hairy, old, sexless, angry. I'm sure this is all very familiar to you. And it worked for a long time. I mean, this is what got us decades worth of backlash. I think that in recent years, there are people who would disagree with me, but I think in recent years there's been a tremendous resurgence in interest in feminism, especially amongst young women and young women who've sort of taken it online and begun to reinvent it for themselves. It doesn't always look like older feminism, but it's sort of, against all odds, feminism has become kind of hot again. And one of the things, and certainly, women's empowerment, to the degree that we now have women running for president, that we, as you point out, when the civil rights movement, when there was a moment that they sort of couldn't deny that this was happening, they made a move to embrace it. I think that is what's happening with feminism, and I think it's been aided by two very specific factors. One was what happened during the Democratic primary, and you and I were on different sides during the Democratic primary, but one of the major complaints about how the Democratic Party, the party that now is supposed to own feminism and women's rights policy, one of the complaints that was made by many Hillary supporters was that the Democratic Party wasn't talking about sexism, wasn't giving Hillary Clinton her due as a history maker, as a feminist history maker, as the first woman to win primaries in American history as the woman to get closest to the presidency in 220 years, there wasn't much acknowledgement of that from the party that was supposed to own women's empowerment and advancement. And what the right did, as soon as Sarah Palin came in, was start crowing about sexism. I mean, I'm sure you remember this. It was terrifying. Sort of sensing that there had been this vacuum of acknowledgement from the Democratic Party of Hillary's achievement. The Republican Party took great pains to talk about sexism every time somebody criticized Sarah Palin, for anything, whether it was sexist or not. There was a lot of sexism aimed at Sarah Palin, but they would call sexism even when it was something that was, absolutely legitimate. And so there was this sort of, wait, we can own this. If you don't want it, we can own it. We can talk about girl power. We can talk about the fact that she's a history maker. We can own that. In part, it's easier for the Republicans to own it because, of course, they don't support either reproductive or labor policy that actually empowers women toward economic, social, and political parity. Therefore, women are a lot less threatening to them because the legislation that most Republicans are talking about is stuff that is not feminist legislation.
But I also see it as kind of a rerun of what we saw during the Bush administration with their sudden embrace of African Americans. And I think that George Bush really prided himself on his anti-racism, and I think he was genuinely not a racist. I think it's one of the few good things you can say about George W. Bush. And he did kind of, he did appoint African Americans to high positions, and he partnered with all of these black churches, and I remember much.
He did also leave New Orleans to drown.
Oh no, I'm not saying that he wasn't. I'm saying that I think that he was. I'm certainly not trying to make a case for his kind of sensitivity to the plight of Black America. I'm just saying. Right. I actually think that his kind of contempt and disregard for the poor was colorblind. But the thing that they did during the Bush administration was really celebrate the fact that they were uniting black and white against basically sexual minorities and feminists. So you had all of these rallies where black churches and white churches would, team up to say that the real danger facing both of us is gay marriage. There was a whole bunch of these so-called racial reconciliation projects where white pastors would beg forgiveness for the sin of racism, and then they would say, and now we're all united, to build a Christian nation. So basically, there was this alliance, although it wasn't an actual alliance, just as now there isn't actual Republican feminism, but there was at least a rhetorical and symbolic alliance of conservatives with some African Americans in which against gay people and kind of uppity women. Right. And if Hillary Clinton had been the nominee, that alliance would have continued, and they probably would have found an African American, if not to put on the ticket. Yes. And then it would have been, the Democrats are still so racist. They're still the party of the old South. That was something that they loved to do, was pretend that the Democratic Party of today is still the party that Strom Thurmond belonged to last century. Or not last century, but you know what I mean, in the middle of the 1900s. And if and when we ever have a woman president, or a Democratic woman president, I think that they'll switch on a dime once again. And just as they, kind of gave up all of this racial reconciliation rhetoric very quickly in favor of kind of white resentment, I think they'll mobilize pretty quickly once again with no shame against feminism and against women.
I think that that's probably right. Although I actually wouldn't discount the possibility, and this is something that I've thought a lot about, and by the way, I'm not making a Sarah Palin suggestion here, which is the thing that people immediately jump to. I wouldn't be surprised if our first woman president weren't a Republican, which is sort of what I thought before Hillary anyway. I always sort of assumed it would be a Margaret Thatcher figure.
Right. And a lot of people used to think our first black president would probably be a Republican military man.
Yeah, that was my assumption too. So maybe we'll be surprised on the woman front too. Maybe I don't think it's particularly far down the road. I'm actually more optimistic about that than a lot of people. But I think it's quite possible that, as you say, in part because of the way the primaries played out. But actually, I want to mention one other factor that's complicating this, and it's something that is very troubling to me, which is the distance that the Democrats are putting between themselves and reproductive rights. So it's not as though, and we can talk about the specifics of that, but there has been this strategy in place for several years amongst, for the Democratic Party to gain majorities in the House and the Senate, that they're running anti-choice Democrats. And, the idea is, if we get majorities, we'll pass progressive legislation. The progressive legislation will be good for women, as I'm always told. Excuse me. What we wind up with is, Bart Stupak and Ben Nelson, holding progressive legislation hostage and having to trade on reproductive rights.
I still generally think
I don't know if you
off.
saw, but Connie Saltonstall, the woman who is the woman who's a big supporter of reproductive rights, who had all the endorsements of the women's groups and had raised a lot of money in Michigan to take on Stupak from the left, and then Stupak dropped out. She has now dropped out because she says that the Democratic Party chair in Michigan was supporting an anti-choice Democrat.
But I don't know enough. I don't know enough about that district to know whether she could have won. But I don't think that that's an outrageous strategy. I mean, I think the Democratic Party of today is, even though it's weaker on choice, it's stronger overall and in a stronger position to fight for choice with its kind of big tent than it was when, say, they weren't letting who was it, the senator from Pennsylvania speak at the Democratic convention because he was anti-abortion. Yeah, I think that that we're better off now with those people inside and with the Republican Party basically eating its own and killing off its moderates and kind of making its litmus tests ever more stringent. I mean, it makes them look more kind of powerful because they're more ideologically united, but they get less done. So I don't really have a problem with them making these compromises in the places where they have to be made.
I think that strategically, I agree with you, of course. I mean, look, I'm one of the people who's bought this. I mean, I'm one of the people who says, you're right, as you're saying. This is for the greater good. This is for the greater progressive good. But I am bothered by the repeated message that the thing that's traded is reproductive rights. And especially when you're in a position where, in fact, those rights are being eroded. The Oklahoma legislation of a couple of weeks ago, there are all kinds of states that are passing crazy erosions of reproductive rights. Doctors are allowed to tell women that, to lie to women about birth defects in their fetuses if they're anti-abortion. And, there is this huge attack on reproductive rights, and it is dispiriting to me. While I agree with you strategically, I'm beside myself that we have healthcare reform. I didn't know that I would see it in my lifetime, and it was possible because of this strategy. I can think that with one half of my brain. At the same time, that I do find it incredibly distressing that the message that is sent is that women's progressive legislation doesn't necessarily include reproductive rights, which to my mind, and I know to your mind, is not true. That progressivism can exist without reproductive rights.
No, of course not.
Right.
And although the other piece of this is that, support for. I think this isn't just about the kind of perfidiousness of the Democratic Party. I think it's also true that support for reproductive rights is softening.
Is that true? Because I hear, everybody who has an agenda reads every poll differently, but I think you're somebody who really knows about this stuff. Is it softening?
All of the polls seem to show that it is, and particularly among younger women. I mean, I read those polls as them basically saying that they don't like abortion, and that they want to see less abortion. And I think that that there's a problem of, people will say more people are willing to identify themselves in polls as pro-life than are willing to come out and say that they want to criminalize abortion. So more people are saying, just in the kind of question, do you identify yourself as pro-choice or pro-life? More people are saying, and more younger women are saying pro-life. Not more younger women than men, but not more younger women that are saying that they're pro-choice, but more younger women than in the past are identifying as pro-life. The question of, should abortion be banned? What should happen to women who have abortions? Those when you start asking those questions, I think there's still a pro-choice majority. And it's interesting because for a long time, the anti-abortion movement has been quite skillful at presenting itself as as being kind of pro-women. We're just trying to protect women. Abortion causes all of these,
right.
And, abortion has all of these terrible consequences, and we're just trying to save women from those. That mask is starting to slip. I mean, particularly in Utah, where they've passed this utterly insane law, basically in response to a girl who hired someone she was so desperate, and she had this late-term pregnancy, and she was so desperate that she hired someone to beat her up in the hope that she would miscarry. And, and the Republicans were angry that they didn't have a law, and not just the Republicans, it passed bipartisanly, they were angry that they didn't have a law to put her in jail. And so they've now passed a law basically that would make procuring a miscarriage, outside of kind of a licensed abortion clinic, I think tantamount to homicide. Yeah. Which is crazy that you look at someone who is so desperate that she's giving someone $150 to beat her up with a baseball bat, and that your response to that is that that's a person who belongs in prison for the rest of her life. But I think, but again, those consequences, those stories, they don't get very much coverage. The women remain somewhat invisible, and most people continue to find the idea of a world. Most people still kind of don't find the idea of forced pregnancy inconceivable, especially regarding their own lives.
Right.
But this segs into what we were. There's another sort of possibly emerging sexual conservatism among younger women that I'm actually find a lot more understandable and kind of I'm personally more sympathetic to. Jessica Gross from XX has a very interesting story kind of taking off from this conference was it at Harvard?
Yes, it was at Harvard. And it was organized by Lena Chen, who's the woman who writes that Sex in the Ivy column that she's had a lot of press over the years. She's a Harvard student. I guess she's graduating now. This was her big send-off.
And I don't think she does write that column anymore. I think she was kind of actually traumatized by that column.
Yes. Well, there were terrible things that happened to her as a result of that column. There was an ex-boyfriend who sent pictures of her around. I mean, I think she was traumatized by that column.
Mm-hmm. But I've also, I guess Jessica Gross argues that, young women in general are becoming more sexually conservative. There's some anecdotal evidence for that, but it's kind of sketchy. I do, and I thought this for a long time, think that organized feminism or, kind of mainstream feminist activists have somewhat missed an opportunity to speak to a lot of young women who found the kind of hookup culture, who found the kind of, emotional brutality of contemporary sexual mores to be really unsatisfying.
Yes. Well, this is, I don't know, did we say that the conference at Harvard was Rethinking Virginity, mm-hmm. which was a lot of people weighing in on the issue of virginity on, there were panels on things like what counts as when you lose your virginity, I gather from reading the coverage of it that it was, how many blowjobs do you give before you can't say you're a virgin anymore? Does, queer sex versus straight sex,
Right, it wasn't an abstinence conference. I mean, it clearly wasn't an abstinence conference.
It wasn't, although what you're pointing out, and that I also read in the coverage, is that several people were talking about reclaiming abstinence, which has become, rightfully, a dirty word because it's been pressed on so many people by religious and moral conservatives, reclaiming abstinence as something for feminism, and which is, I think, what you're getting at. And
I'm not even getting
it's funny because at the same time that Jessica Gross wrote this very astute piece about a generation of young women who have, been raised in a sort of very sex-positive stew, there was the kind of sister of that piece appeared in the New York Post, the tabloid daily newspaper in New York about a bunch of young women also taking abstinence pledges, women who'd been having tons of sex, and one woman had, hooked up with some guy on a subway platform, and the next morning he asked her name, and she said, "I'm not having sex again for a few weeks." So I do think that there's a pendulum swing here, because, of course, the sex positivity of young feminism was in response to a lot of things, in the way that the sexual revolution, in part, was in response to the very strict mores, and the pressures on women to not be sexual beings.
Well, and sex-positive feminism was a response to, like, Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon, and what was seen as a kind of very puritanical type of feminism that, that seemed kind of contemptuous of all eroticism, and that, and that women felt were kind of, taking genuine sources of pleasure away from them or trying to stigmatize them. But sex-positive feminism became something in which, women were expected to be as casual and callous about sex as the most kind of casual and callous men. I mean, I've often said that the only person who's ever made me feel really and truly ashamed of my sex life and my sexuality was this woman I once interviewed when I was in my very early 20s, named Betty Dodson, kind of this masturbation promoter.
I interviewed her once, and I was on the Betty Dodson mailing list for a long time.
And I remember, I think I said to her something, at the time I was living with my boyfriend, and I don't remember exactly what I said, but something to the extent of, or something, that what I wanted was a monogamous relationship. And I remember her just making me feel so, like, A, ridiculous, and B, like, fatalistic. Like, that's not realistic, it's completely hopeless. And I remember thinking that if I had told her that, say, I kept two men in the basement in latex and, like, took them out once a day to whip them, that would have, she would have kind of encouraged me and told me that was, celebrate me for expressing myself.
Right. I felt very similar pressures, actually, not from Betty Dodson personally, but there was, and also I saw a lot of my friends experience these kind of pressures, and it was both within just sort of, it wasn't even necessarily within a feminist community, though that was part of it, but there is a sort of expectation about sex positivity, and because we have now years in which it is okay to be single and sexual and sexually active, unfortunately, that has come with the expectation that in order to own your sexuality, it means having sex all the time. And that's not the case for a lot of people of every age and, every social cohort. There are lots of people who like to have lots of sex. I do think there are lots of people who do love to have casual sex, but there are lots of people for whom that's just not the thing. And in its own way, I think that pressure to keep two men in the basement in latex is just as suffocating and makes you feel just as much shame if you don't do that as the expectations for chastity and some kind of female purity. And I do think that has been a tremendous pendulum shift. As Jessica Gross points out, it's also been exacerbated by the technology available to young women and the sort of encouragement of making your sexuality not just active, but publicly active. So you have a generation of women. Lena Chin is a great example because she wrote this column about her sex life at Harvard. But there are lots of young college sex columnists out there who've gotten a lot of attention. It is one of the quickest ways to get attention if you're a young woman, both within a social context, whether it's posting on your Facebook page about your sex life or blogging or writing a column about it, to talk about one's sex life. When I was a young writer writing a movie column, I was offered freelance work to write about sex toys. It's one of the things that women are encouraged to do. And in fact, one of the things they're paid to do.
Right, and there's actually kind of few ways that you can kind of garner more rewards as a writer, particularly a young writer starting out. I mean, if you kind of are willing to be somewhat voyeuristic, it's often it's a ticket to major bylines. And, I don't even know if I'm exaggerating when I say that most of the women who get major bylines in magazines like The Atlantic, to some extent, like the New York Times magazine, it's usually women who are willing to reveal something of their private life, kind of sexually, or it's either women, actually, let me take that back. It's either women who are willing to reveal, kind of to expose themselves and reveal their private lives and their humiliations, or it's women who are willing to condemn other women, or, you have someone like Caitlin Flanagan, which is some combination of the two.
Well, it's also both. Part of the reason I wrote about this phenomenon maybe a year or a year and a half ago when Emily Gould, the young blogger, was on the cover of the New York Times Magazine. Her book has just come out the past couple weeks, actually. But I wrote about this exact thing, which was that this idea, and I did experience a smaller version of it, that young women's writing voices are thought to be interesting enough to merit magazine covers when they are exposing themselves either erotically or making themselves vulnerable in traditionally gendered roles, i.e. as a sexual person, as an emotional person, writing about their feelings, their relationships, their domestic lives, their emotional states. But I think one of the cycle that gets you into is that you have these women elevated and given an enormous amount of attention, and then they are just abused, for having revealed themselves in one way or another, which is something that I think is part of what happened to Lena Chen, the young woman at Harvard. Mm-hmm. And it's certainly what happened to Emily Gould, whose sort of personal exploration involving a breakup and a boyfriend and her sex life and panic attacks and the anxieties of young womanhood, which was extremely revealing and extremely vulnerable, and was given this spot on the top, the New York Times Magazine, and then she was just mercilessly ripped apart. So that in fact those two, attractions, sort of elevating women who willing to expose themselves, make themselves vulnerable / erotic, combined with the desire to see women torn down, actually usually winds up working as one single cycle.
What did you think? I didn't read Emily Gould's memoir, but I think she's a good writer. What did you think of it?
I really actually liked it very, very much, and I wasn't totally expecting to. I like Emily Gould's writing. I had written both critically about that piece in the New York Times Magazine, but also because I felt like the cycle that she'd gotten into was part of this larger thing where we like to elevate and then attack women. And I read the memoir and was surprised by how quickly I went through it, how much I enjoyed it. One of the things that I liked about it, I happened to be thinking at that point about a piece about women and happiness and the expectations for women, that they should always be feeling happy in one way or another. And one of the things I liked so much about Emily Gould's memoir, which she's been criticized for in other places, is that there's no sort of happy ending arc here. There's no what I've learned. It's about her youth. It's about a series of jobs she had and some bad relationships. And basically a time of real discontent in her early 20s as a young woman in New York. And there's no obvious learning curve there, which some critics have found really frustrating. But I really admired it because I thought it was pretty real. And I thought it was pretty honest about how sometimes there actually isn't a learning curve and there isn't a greater moral lesson.
Right, and there's never an epiphany after which nothing was ever the same again.
Right. Well, no, I think there are moments where you can have small epiphanies, but they don't come often. Mm-hmm. And they don't come, maybe they... I didn't think it needed that. I didn't need to know what Emily Gould learned. She says in several points in the book, I would have done it the same. Again, this is, she resists, and I think she's given some interviews where she's talked about resisting this urge to sort of tie it up neatly and say what I learned and how I've changed. So instead, but in resisting that, she writes in the book quite often, I didn't learn anything, I haven't changed. I am the same person who made these dumb moves, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever. And I appreciated that. And she is a very, very good writer.
But tell me, because you were working on that happiness piece, which I both kind of loved and found it a bit of a relief. Do you see any difference between, on the one hand, these kind of studies of, if you don't have kids soon, you're going to be unhappy, or if you do have kids, you're going to be unhappy, or single women are so unhappy, this kind of constant drumbeat of like, you're doing it wrong, kind of whatever you're doing. Do you see that as being different than books like Gretchen Rubin's, or some of these things that are pure techniques that you can use to make yourself happier, or do you see that as part of the same kind of, coercive current, I guess?
Well, I think that I do see it all as very different. And in fact, in this piece that I wrote about women and happiness, I make reference to a bunch of different things, and they all serve a different purpose, and some of them are very valuable. For instance, a group of memoirs about sort of dissolving marriages that I happened to read, in recent months, because they all came out recently, by Julie Metz and Isabel Gillies. The wonderful book, The Husbands and Wives Club, about a year in couples group therapy by Lori Abraham. Those are all, I cite those books as sort of giving the message that marriage is hard and unhappy and full of toil and sweat and labor and, but those in fact are terrific books. I don't mean to suggest that that they're exactly part of the problem. They contribute a small and readable element to the larger problem. By the same token, I don't think that there's anything wrong with Gretchen Rubin's Happiness Project book, in which she sort of recommends all these practical ways to get happier. Sing in the morning, make your bed. Those are the two I always go back to. And then there are these scientific studies, like the one done by, there's a guy at Princeton and then two researchers at the University of Pennsylvania that sort of are evaluating women's happiness. And saying, men and women's happiness. And they conclude, they've gotten a lot of press in the past couple of years, women are unhappy. Women are more unhappy than they were in the 1970s. Women are more unhappy since the second wave. Maybe, and then from that, sort of polemicists extrapolate all kinds of things. Liberation has made women unhappy. Choice has made women unhappy. And then that ties into the more self-helpy genre. Or the self-improvement, here are the ways you're doing life wrong. Sylvia Ann Hewlett, you better have a baby because your ovaries are turning into raisins. Lori Gottlieb, you better find a husband because, even if you want to have a baby on your own, you'll be miserable. And then the kinds of press releases that I get all the time from places saying, married women are miserable. They're jealous of single women because single women have all this fun, and married women are miserable and hate taking care of their kids.
I actually just as a married woman who maybe because I don't have kids, but I think I've said this before. I've never understood what people mean when they say that marriage is work, much less hard work. And maybe it's just marriage to my particular husband is not work. But I also suspect that there are there's no reason to write about your happy marriage.
Right.
In fact,
one of the things that's interesting is and this was pointed out by somebody writing on Jezebel, Sadie Stein, writing on Jezebel, who pointed out, we hate, and this goes back to the tearing women down, we actually hate women who talk about how happy they are.
Right.
Nobody responds well to that, actually. So in addition to all the finger wagging about you're unhappy because you're not married, or you're unhappy because you're married, or you're unhappy because you don't have kids, or you'll be miserable when you do have kids, you'll get married or you'll be lonely, you'll never meet anybody again, or if you're married, you'll never have sex again. In addition to all that, anybody who actually has the audacity to say, as you just did, and as I would about my relationship with my boyfriend, well, it's, I love it, I'm happy, that doesn't go over well. Nobody wants to hear that.
Right, and to a certain extent, I understand nobody wants, hey, look how great my life is. I guess that's irritating. I certainly don't, I certainly wouldn't write that in my own case, although I, would say, look how great this one part of my life is.
Right.
But yeah, either people assume, that you're being a bitch, or else they assume that, your husband really has some, other family hidden in the basement.
Right. Oh, they're very eager to tell you, like, oh, just you wait.
Right.
You know, you think you're happy now? Wait till you have kids and all the domestic inequities of your relationship are going to be laid bare. You know, everybody's eager to tell you all the various ways in which you will eventually be happy, even if you dare to say that you're happy now.
And I think, you know, Elizabeth Gilbert just wrote, so I just read something that she wrote, actually, I think it was in response to Piper Kerman's memoir.
I haven't read it, but
she just wrote this little piece somewhere, or maybe she sent it to a magazine, like when they asked her a question about how, you know, it's like women kind of living on their own and making their own choices and creating their own lives is still a relatively new thing in the world and a relatively new thing in human history, and so it's not surprising that people are still trying and writing about how they're kind of figuring it out.
Yes.
But part of the difficulty, I think, you know, for myself and, you know, maybe for kind of all women young or like me, you know, not so young, who are making who are making these decisions, is that turning to books alone is not going to give you, is not a good guide. I mean, you know, people but there aren't a lot of good guides out there. You kind of have to search them out, like personally, out in the world. You're not going to get, you know, the media is not going to, and maybe is kind of unable to provide like a realistic or a workable model for how to live your life. Right.
Well, it's certainly, I mean, I wouldn't recommend turning to these other, you know, I agree with you that you're not going to find your answer in the media, but on the other hand, you know, nobody ever went broke underestimating Americans' insecurity and desire to find guidance from some source, especially, and this is exactly the kind of thing that can sort of be flipped into a terrible backlash sentiment where they say, see, all this liberation makes women unhappy. But it is absolutely true that we remain in uncharted territory, this world in which women remain often single and often childless, into sometimes their early 40s, in which reproductive technology means extended possibility, in which reconfiguring of the American family, including all sorts of single, double, triple parent, quadruple parent households, gay families, straight families, there are now so many more options. Even a generation ago, it was very black and white. You were either, and by the way, the new options also include getting married at 22 and having kids at 22. Mm-hmm. But there used to be this sort of binary situation for women, and which led to, you know, unhappiness on both ends. You know, lots of people trapped in unhappy marriages, and lots of people, you know, sort of feeling undervalued as, you know, spinsters. But now we are in such uncharted terrain as far as the choices that women make, that people can make a lot of money making those women feel bad about whatever choice they are making.
I know.
There's an incentive now to push in one direction or another because there's so much flexibility and we're just unused to it. There's no sort of simple right or wrong answer, or this is what you're supposed to have done by now, this is not what you're supposed to have done. Are you doing it right? Are you not doing it right? And women who've made different choices, you know, are anxious to advertise the rightness of their choices. Men who, you know, you get into a whole marketplace of social pressure in which people can make a lot of money by
exploiting it and saying, you know, how to basically find the one true way to be living your life.
And even take away the sort of marketplace, the professional marketplace of it, even within social situations, because I wrote in that piece also that I've heard from friends, you know, who, and I don't know if you've had this experience with your friends, but because there are so many choices, and I think we often question, are we doing the right things? This is not unique to women. I think men question it too. You know, is it right to get married? Am I going to be happy having kids? Am I going to be happy taking this job or quitting this job? And we sort of wonder, you can't help but wonder, it's human nature, you know, whether the grass is greener, whether the path not chosen would have made you happier. But that creates also a social investment in advising, pushing, laying your experience on top of the experience of one of your friends or contemporaries and saying, oh, well, this is how it was for me. And it creates this, sort of constant pressure that says you should be doing it differently, no matter what it is. There's no approved path anymore. Mm-hmm. Every choice you can make as a woman, there's somebody there to wag a finger at you and say, that's going to make you really unhappy. And, part of what I was arguing for in that piece was sort of moving away from this bar of happiness that somehow, for many good and noble reasons, we've set for ourselves, our parents have set for us. Now science is setting, sort of psychological research is setting for us, and saying, you know what, there's value in unhappiness too, or in discontent or ambivalence. And that's sort of part of what I was trying to say in that happiness piece.
Well, I thought what you were saying was just happiness is kind of more of a byproduct than the goal that you have to be constantly kind of vigilantly striving towards.
Yes, I don't think it's a default condition. I think it's something
it's an incidental, occasional experience.
Yes, and and look, you could be very, very lucky and get it is more than occasionally, and that's terrific. But there'll be points in your life where it comes frequently and points where it comes rarely, and that's true, I think, for every life. And sort of this sense that we constantly have to be taking our temperatures and registering it happy is unrealistic and only sets up another area in which we will undoubtedly fail.
Should we end it there?
Yeah, I'm okay with that. Are we good for time?
Yeah.
All right.
I think, we can continue it soon over drinks.
That would be terrific.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Bye, Rebecca.
Bye.